Earlier, I mentioned that Bob Marley himself was a Rastafarian. One wonders, what is a Rastafarian? You could Google it, and I suggest you do. Wikipedia has an incredibly interesting entry on Rastafarianism. But just as a kind of way for you to understand a little bit about it, Marley himself was a Rastafarian. He declared himself to be a Rasta in the 1960s when he moved from St. Anne's in the rural parish to Kingston, right? And when he moved to Kingston to be with his mother had then met the father of Bonnie Whaler, who would be part of the Whalers, and during that time, Marley was learning about Rastafarianism and so on. But it's always important to remember, because when the question is asked of Marley, when did you become a Rastafarian? His cryptic answer is that I've been a Rasta ever since, suggesting that he was always a Rasta. And while it's clear that there's a point at which Marley moves from what seems to be a largely sort of conventional Christian background and Christian understanding of himself towards this Rastafarianism, which would be a shift away. There is a sense in which Marley, because he grew up with a grandfather who was in fact a Garveyite and therefore a pro-Africanist. That is, a Garveyite was a follower of Marcus Garvey, also somebody whose name will come up in Marley's songs and in Marley's lyrics, and it's very important that you find out a little bit more about Marcus Garvey. Again, you're blessed with the easy access to Wikipedia. Well, Marcus Garvey, who was a Jamaican who eventually would move to America and lead what is essentially one of the largest, which was essentially the largest pro-black activist group in the history of America, and was emerged and was in holding full sway, particularly in the New York area, even at the time when the NAACP had invented. They were almost in competition. This Garvey, whose essential doctrine was one that would come to influence people like Malcolm X quite significantly. Malcolm X's own father was a Garveyite as well. Really proposed that there was a need to return to Africa for African people to find an existence in Africa and to find a place in Africa, because their lives in exile from Africa was horribly deprived and terrible. So Marley grew up with a grandfather who was a believer in the connections with Africa. So Marley then comes to Kingston, where Rastafarianism exists. How does Rastafarianism exist in Kingston? Well, Rastafarianism is one of the more recent religious orders and society and organizations. By that I mean it's a 20th century belief system. It's a belief system that really had its emergence in the 20th century, although it's very clear that its antecedents, its sort of roots and its basis would go back into the 19th century, would go back into the syncretistic belief systems that would also characterize movements like Voodoo and the influence of Voodoo as a radical belief system, and other Santeria from Cuba, and of course the Yoruba movements throughout Brazil and so on, where African belief systems sort of tying into European or Western, I would say Western, and really what you're talking about is essentially you're returning to African belief systems, which would be Islam and Christianity, um, uh, and therefore then transforming them into this new belief system. There's a sense in which what these belief systems did was they began to locate in a religion the centrality of the black person, where as a kind of resistance to a long Christian tradition, which was a perverted tradition that posited whiteness as the basis of its existence, that presented the Christ as, for instance, a white person, that presented God as a bearded white person, as part of the colonial enterprise. And so these movements were movements that were beginning to suggest that there is a spiritual vitality and a spiritual authenticity in the body of people of color, of black people, and in the belief systems that emerge out of those people. Rastafarianism comes out of that same tradition, comes out of that tradition of resistance and of course, a re-emergent spirituality. In 1938, we begin to see the beginnings of Rastafarianism. It begins to be articulated, and it's articulated out of what would be called spiritual communities, largely Christian communities in Kingston, not in Kingston, but in rural part of Jamaica. And there was a man called Howell who was really one of the leaders of such a movement, who then began to propose a way of thinking that was being very much influenced by two forces. One would be Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, and the other would be Marcus Garvey, referring to Haile Selassie of Ethiopia. In 1931, Haile Selassie becomes the emperor of Ethiopia. And becoming the emperor of Ethiopia, he then assumes the title of King of Kings and Lord of Lords and the conquering Lion of the tribe of Judah as part of the Ethiopian mythic tradition and the Ethiopian tradition of its not just its myths but its entire religious understanding. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has its roots in the narrative in two key moments in the biblical account. One is the emergence of a Judaic tradition in Ethiopia that was often seen as dating as far back as the Queen of Sheba, who appears in the Bible, who comes to visit David, and who belongs, of course, to Ethiopia. So there's a long history of Ethiopian Christianity, Ethiopian Judaism, that would then become Ethiopian Christianity. So that's one part of that narrative of what Ethiopian spirituality is. And then, of course, part of it is in the New Testament when there's the Ethiopian eunuch who Philip converts and baptizes, and he returns to Ethiopia. And in tradition, that Ethiopian eunuch begins the Christian church in Ethiopia. So the Christian church in Ethiopia is even older than the Catholic Church. The Eastern Ethiopian Orthodox Church is older and has a longer history than even the Catholic Church in Europe. And there's that long tradition. So Rastafarians recognize in Haile Selassie the emergence of this man who is part of a nation that successfully resists the colonialism of the Italians, successfully resists that colonialism through war and through battle. And it is true that to this day, Ethiopia is the only country that was never colonized, the only country in Africa that was never colonized by the Europeans. And of course, for many, in 1931, when the big coronation takes place, it becomes a global thing. National Geographic devotes an entire issue to the coronation of Haile Selassie. And of course, the world is paying attention. And this small group of believers, they're largely Christianized believers, begin to believe that in Haile Selassie is the full incarnation of God. So the most crude and simplistic way to think about Rastafarianism relative to other belief systems is probably in this way. And it's a simplistic way, but it also makes complete sense because it helps us to understand that these are belief systems of the book, and these are belief systems that are emerging out of cultures. So in the doctrine of Judaism, the Messiah is to come. The Messiah has been anticipated and is to come, and is spoken of as to come in the book of Psalms, in the book of Hosea, in the prophecies of some of the late prophets of the Old Testament. The Messiah is to come. And in Judaism, there is still the anticipation of the coming Messiah. Christianity then says that the Messiah did come. The Messiah has come, and he came in the form of Christ. Christ is the fulfillment of the prophecy of Isaiah. Isaiah prophesies that this Messiah will arrive, and Christ is the returned Messiah, and therefore Christ then prophesies and declares himself to return again. He will return again to take captivity captive and set the captives free and so on. Rastafarians then say that that returned Messiah has come in the form of Haile Selassie, the Emperor of Ethiopia, and that he is of the same descendant lineage of Christ and, of course, of David and so on and so forth, so that God then returned. He is then the God incarnate and returned. Therefore, God is an African and an Ethiopian and is Haile Selassie. Now, you may have all kinds of questions about this idea and this notion and so on and so forth. But one of the things that is important is to understand it as an act of faith and so on. It's a faith that becomes complicated and in dramatic ways and in powerful ways. And we will come into that, especially when historically Haile Selassie is ousted in 1970, I think 73, 74. And then he's reported dead. So then, does God die? How do you deal with this idea? But Rastafarianism, therefore, has the belief system that says that Haile Selassie is the Messiah, and the term Rastafari comes from the title of Haile Selassie as Ras, and a Ras is a title in Amharic, in the Ethiopian language, of somebody of dignity and so on and so forth. And Haile Selassie, one of his titles is Rasta or Ras. So a Rastafarian is somebody who has that belief. And there are all kinds of practices and beliefs that come with Rastafarianism that draw from the Old and New Testament and also from the Ethiopian biblical text that is part of its own narrative and so on. Mali embraced Rastafarianism, the growing of locks, prayer, the smoking of marijuana. All of these things become part of the belief systems of Rastas, and in a sense, to think of Mali as a pop star is to miss the fact that Mali was essentially and believed himself to be a part of a mission, and a mission which was to carry out the purposes and the views and the ideas and the goals of Haile Selassie. And at the heart of that was the restoration of Africans, restoration of the dignity of Africans, a restoration of the power of Africans. So that's a brief as ever overview of Rastafarianism. Mali never shifted, he never changed, he never lost his belief in Rastafarianism. And he grew to have a very intimate and moving relationship with this belief and this faith and with the family of Haile Selassie. But more on that soon.